We're going to be looking at the history of the Golden Age of comics. And to study that history, we kind of have to look at the timeline leading up to the Golden Age, starting with our very first comic book, The Yellow Kid. A little controversial on whether that's actually the first comic book, but a lot of people consider that the first collected edition of a comic storyline with sequential panels and the use of word balloons. It's also important to note that the style of graphic narrative has started to influence graphic narrative styles of the East, especially in Japan, and you see some European influences in Japanese comics. But we will talk more about that in our history of manga later on. Throughout the early part of the 20th century, comics began to get more popular. They mostly are still a collection of the comic strips that were running in newspapers, though we do see a little bit of holdover for some new characters. One of the most popular comic strip characters of the early 20th century was Krazy Kat and George Harriman, with his parable-like story of the black cat who's always being rejected by the white mouse for his love. Some of the early books that actually started to be original comic books that were not included in comic strips. A lot of these comic strips were started out as comic strips in newspapers, but we did start to see original stories appear in comic books up until the 1930s, with stories like The Phantom, Popeye, other stories, but comics didn't really begin to take off until the first superhero comic, which is Action Comics #1. Action Comics #1 invented the idea of a superhero being a hero that fights for truth and justice, is a hero of the people, and wears this fanciful costume and has some sort of extraordinary power. The Superman character is the very first of these that inspired a whole plethora of comic books in its style, starting with Whiz Comics. Now, Whiz Comics was thought to be a ripoff of Superman. However, Whiz Comics with Captain Marvel, nowadays known as Shazam, became actually more popular in terms of comic book sales than Superman, so much so that Action Comics wound up suing Whiz Comics and actually won that lawsuit, and Whiz Comics had to come off the market. Later on, Action Comics would purchase the rights to Whiz Comics and the character for Captain Marvel. Batman was also created at that time. While Batman doesn't necessarily have superpowers in the traditional sense, and one of his superpowers are primarily his intellect and his ultimate resources and how wealthy he is. But he's also very intelligent and is great at fighting crime and these crazy style villains. And then the other big title that came out during this time was Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was a big sensation, is really the first female hero to win the hearts of America. But all of these characters began to have a big role in one of the biggest events during the Golden Age, and that is World War II. Now, before the United States entered World War II, the superhero characters started fighting the Nazis first and fighting the Japanese first. So both Superman and Captain America, as a part of an effort to convince Americans that we should take a stand against the Nazi powers and the fascist powers around the world, they began to fight these villains in their comic books long before the United States actually started fighting in these wars. Not just Superman, not just Captain America, but Wonder Woman also joined the fight, as well as Batman. Here's Batman fighting Nazis on a Nazi U-boat. And here is Captain America famously punching out Adolf Hitler, again, long before the US enters the war. Not only were they depicting the fascist nations as villains in their comic books, but they actually were also worked with the US government in being a propaganda piece to help raise money for the war effort in the form of selling bonds to raise money to help our soldiers. These efforts happened after the United States entered the war, but they were a pretty important part of the war effort. The Golden Age does start the fascination in the later part of the 20th century with superheroes. Superheroes becomes the primary genre that is popular for the rest of the 20th century in the United States. There are other popular genres, though, and in this era of the Golden Age, we see the rise of certain comics after the war because people start to wane a little bit in interest in superhero comics and they start to read other comic books. A lot of the people who were of comic book reading age started to grow up and started to become interested in more grown-up ideas such as crime stories, horror stories, romance stories, science fiction stories. But many of these stories started to get some pushback from critics who thought that these were also coinciding with a rise in juvenile delinquency. Juvenile delinquency means children committing crimes. There was a section of the public that believed that the influence of comics was a big influence in the rise of crime, especially among underage individuals. The primary proponent of this idea was Frederick Wortham in his best-selling book, The Seduction of the Innocent. In The Seduction of the Innocent, he pretty much blames most of comic violence as translating into real-life violence amongst the youth. And so he testified to Congress, and there was a big outrage. Our legislative leaders put a lot of pressure on the comic book industry to censor themselves. Otherwise, they said that they would add their own censorship, legal censorship, to the comic book industry themselves. Though whether that would be legal under the First Amendment is very questionable, but the pressure was there nonetheless. So the comic book industry agreed, and they created what's known as the Comics Code. The Comics Code was a series of rules that was created and run by the Comics Code Authority. The Comics Code Authority was the organization that enforced the Comics Code and enforced these rules. Some of the rules seemed pretty innocuous, such as the idea that crimes shall never be presented in a way to create sympathy for the criminal or to promote distrust of law and justice with the desire to imitate criminals. There were a lot of critics at that time that said that really limits what comic creators can do in their stories, such as you could no longer have police or government officials being the villains in any of their stories that were not allowed under the code. Also, one of the big enemies of the code at the time were in the horror and terror titles. They actually banned the word horror or terror in the title of any of the books, and also banned any stories revolving around vampires, Walking Dead, werewolfism. Any of those classic horror style stories were considered distasteful and a bad influence on the youth. So in order to be carried by most newsstands, the books had to get this stamp. You could not get this stamp unless it was approved by the Comics Code Authority organization that made sure that all the books fell under the rules. Because of that, all these stories that started to become really popular no longer qualified under the rules, and they could not get the stamp. Now, without the stamp, many newsstands, which is the most popular way of distributing books, was through newsstands. Many of the newsstands decided that they would not carry any comic books that did not have the stamp. So without these stamps, these stories, basically the sales dropped out so low that they came off the market. And that brings us to the end of the Golden Age. Well, I hope you enjoyed that very brief outline of the Golden Age of comics. We will see you next time with information about the Silver Age.